How often when you're eating does that get caught in your mouth?
I can't eat spaghetti with this.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we're here to talk about easily one of the top 5, if not maybe the top 3 most important punk bands of all time, the Misfits. First of all, in my personal opinion, Danzig-era Misfits is the single best collection of songs in the entire genre. And you can hear their influence in everything from My Chemical Romance to Metallica, despite the fact that the original lineup of the band only released 2 full-length albums while they were actually together. And if you've ever wondered where the connection between horror and comic books and metal and punk comes from, well, you can largely thank the Misfits for that too. Their logo is also one of the most iconic symbols in all of rock. You've seen their shirts on everyone from CM Punk to Mia Khalifa to XXXTentacion. It's right up there with legendary stuff like the Rolling Stones' tongue. But the story of the Misfits is not all smiles. After suddenly breaking up in 1983, the band was torn apart by a decades-long feud between Jerry Only and Glenn Danzig that eventually culminated in a lawsuit. And years later, they reunited, but in a move that alienated a lot of fans, they replaced Glenn Danzig on vocals with Michale Graves, who recently became an even more polarizing figure earlier this year when he testified on behalf of the Proud Boys. But despite all of that, the Misfits remain one of the single most loved bands in history. So what's behind the lasting appeal of the Misfits even 40 years after their prime? And what is their lasting impact and influence? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. And also, this video is sponsored by the Silver Scream Con. It's 3 days of horror, music, and gore put on by my good friends in Ice 9 Kills. It all goes down September 8th through the 10th at the Doubletree North Shore in Danvers, Massachusetts. And you can get your ticket at the link in the description of this video. It's got a crazy lineup of guests from a ton of the movies that their music draws inspiration from. They've also got some amazing panels hosted by another good friend of mine, Ryan J. Downey, and Ice 9 Kills will be playing a concert at Lynn Auditorium in Lynn, Massachusetts on Saturday, September 9th as part of the event. There's going to be horror, toy, and other vendors. Ice 9 Kills will be bringing limited edition merch. There's also going to be tons of photo ops, and of course, last but not least, the chance to hang out with your fellow psychos. This thing is going to be awesome. And if you want to get your ticket, head to silverscreencon.com or hit the link in the description of this video. The first time that I heard the Misfits was in my 7th grade art class back in 1990, when my friend Matt gave me a dubbed cassette copy of Walk Among Us. But the band's history goes back much earlier than that. Glenn Danzig formed the Misfits in 1976, after being in a few sort of unsuccessful local bands like Talus, and another one called Ku Dot and Boojang, which I have to say is one of the single worst band names I've ever heard in my life. He came up with the name Misfits after the final Marilyn Monroe film, and after meeting bassist Jerry Only, the band was born. Their first release came in 1977 with the Cough Cool single, which hardly resembles the Misfits that most people know. This was before their iconic logo and all the horror imagery and all that stuff. And there's actually no guitarist in the band, just instead of that, there's Glenn Danzig on keyboards. They also played their first shows, both at the legendary club CBGB in New York. And at that time, the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where CBGB's was this like incredibly sketchy place full of absolutely wild people, whereas the Misfits were from suburban Lodi, New Jersey. And being around the CBGB crowd that early made them realize that actually they didn't really fit in with the New York punk scene, and helped them find the direction that would ultimately define the band. As Jerry Only later said, "When you went into New York, everybody was shooting dope. I wasn't about that. That's why we came up with the horror thing. We loved horror films, sci-fi, B-movies. We weren't drug-shooting beatnik Bowery boys." Another critical moment for the band came around the same time. Their first single was self-released via their own label that they called Blank Records. And shortly after that, Mercury Records wanted to start their own imprint, also named Blank Records, not realizing that Glenn Danzig already had a trademark in the name. And so Glenn Danzig gave them the Blank Records name in exchange for 30 hours of studio time and the option to release the songs that the band recorded in that time, which were intended to be their first album, Static Age. Mercury ended up passing on those songs, which left the Misfits free to release them on their own on their new label that Glenn called Plan 9, which was a reference to the cult sci-fi movie Plan 9 from Outer Space. They took the songs from Static Age and released some of them as singles, while others were actually never officially released while the band was together, including some of their best songs like Hybrid Moments. And by this point, their sound had evolved from the kind of dark, keyboard-driven stuff on the Cough Cool single into something that sounded like a more raw, stripped-down version of 1950s rock and roll like Elvis than it did something like the more highbrow stuff that a lot of other bands of the era were drawing from, like maybe the Velvet Underground. This is also when they started to develop their classic logo and imagery, starting with the Horror Business single in 1979, which is the first time that their iconic skull logo appeared, which itself was borrowed from an obscure 1940s movie called The Crimson Ghost, which is what people now call that logo. They had also started painting skeleton bones on some of their stage outfits. Jerry Only created their signature devil lock hair. And other bands like the Cramps had certainly flirted with the sort of like B-movie horror kind of imagery, but the Misfits were the first ones to really go all in on that. And all of that added up to something very different than what the rest of the punk scene was doing. For example, the Hollywood and New York scenes were the sort of like highbrow artsy thing, but then here you had the Misfits who were from suburban New Jersey, and they were into comic books and horror movies, and they lifted weights. The Misfits were basically a very deliberately lowbrow version of punk. And I was barely alive back then, so I can't say what it was like firsthand, but it's clear from listening to people who were around at the time that what the Misfits were doing was instantly seen as something very special. As Ian Mackay of Minor Threat said, "The first Misfits singles just knocked me out. They were so interesting and mysterious. I had no idea what to make of them. Danzig was deeply talented, a genius as a kid. His lyrics puzzled me. Paint my mirrors black for you. What the fuck does that mean?" Another aspect of the band that doesn't get enough attention, in my opinion, is their kind of DIY hustle and work ethic from a business perspective. Because remember, in the late 70s, there weren't really any options for punk bands unless they were one of the very few who got signed to a major label. And so bands like Black Flag, Minor Threat, Dead Kennedys, and the Misfits said, fuck it, we'll start our own label. And the Misfits in particular, I think, were really brilliant at the merchandising aspect, probably influenced by the horror and toy industries. They were very early to the idea of putting out limited edition colored vinyl that collectors would really seek out. They screen printed their own merch in Glenn's mom's basement, and they even started their own fan club called the Misfits Fiend Club, where they would offer exclusive merch and other benefits, which is actually still around to this day. They continued self-releasing singles and EPs. They recorded a second album, which once again went unreleased. They went on a very ill-fated tour of England where they got thrown in jail after supposedly getting in a fight with skinheads, which was the inspiration for the song London Dungeon. And in 1982, they finally released their first full-length album, Walk Among Us, on Ruby Records, after almost 6 years as a band. And this was everything that they had been working towards. The songs were tighter, the production was cleaner, still very rough by today's standards, but pretty good for like an 80s punk band. And the artwork was this very cool, really unique collage of elements from all these older B movies, like Earth versus the Flying Saucer and Angry Red Planet. The album got almost universal praise, and to this day is regarded as one of the all-time classics of the genre. Dave Brockie of Gwar, rest in peace, said that it was a nearly perfect album. They were the punk rock Kiss, but they were a million times better than Kiss. They never made any shitty music. Personally, I kind of prefer the earlier singles, but regardless, Walk Among Us is a classic by any measure. And the band was bigger than ever, sometimes drawing over 1,000 people to shows, which was a huge amount for a punk band in the 80s, but they were already starting to fall apart. Danzig wanted the band to go in sort of an artsier, darker kind of direction. Jerry wanted to do something more like the punk version of Kiss, and Doyle was increasingly getting into metal. But they stuck it out long enough for one final release, which is Earth AD in 1983. And this is much more in the vein of hardcore than the melodic punk of their early material. Personally, this is my least favorite thing that the original version of the band ever did, but it's still a solid hardcore album, and I've always loved the cover art. I remember literally looking at it under a magnifying glass as a kid and spending hours just trying to copy all the little details. And this album was certainly influential in its own right. As Jerry Only later said, what Earth AD did was launch the hardcore scene, the death metal scene, the thrash scene, all those other bands, Slayer, Anthrax, Megadeth, Metallica, all those bands that came after us used that as their guiding light. But shortly after that, the band abruptly broke up after their annual Halloween show with the Necros. Their drummer accidentally got too drunk to play. They threw him out of the band mid-set, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The Misfits were done less than 2 years after their debut album was released. After the breakup, Glenn went on to do Sam Hain and Danzig, while Jerry and Doyle did a Christian metal band called Christ the Conqueror. And on the one hand, you could sort of look at the Misfits as almost like this cursed band. Because really, as far as official releases go, they only had 2 albums. Everything else you could only get by fighting collectors to pay sky-high prices for the originals, or somehow tracking down bootlegs, which were oftentimes pretty rare and expensive themselves. Which is actually still true to this day. For example, the yellow vinyl version of Horror Business can go for up to $2,000. But this also created kind of a cool air of mystery around the band where you really had to seek their music out. Like, after I discovered them, it took me several years to ever get the chance to hear some of their less common songs like, say, Return of the Fly or Ratfink. But what saved them from becoming just another one of these obscure cult bands was a few things. The first one was Metallica. They covered the Misfits on their 1987 EP Garage Days Revisited, and this was a huge moment for the Misfits. As Glenn Danzig said, I first met them at a Black Flag gig, and then we became kind of friends. We'd often bump into each other on the road, and then one day Cliff called me up asking for the lyrics to Last Caress and Green Hell, the old Misfits song. James and Cliff helped to spread the word about me, and I was very grateful to them.
Here in this place lies the genie of death. Is that what it is? I thought it was key to your death.
Metallica obviously were the biggest metal band of this era who sold millions and millions of albums, and I think that did a lot to spread awareness of the Misfits. For example, I later found out that's how my friend who gave me that Walk Among Us tape back in 7th grade discovered the Misfits, so I guess I indirectly discovered the Misfits through Metallica too. There was also the success of Glenn's solo career with Sam Hain and then Danzig, who had signed to Rick Rubin's label Def Jam. Danzig were slowly getting more and more success, eventually getting a certified mainstream rock hit when Mother blew up in 1993, courtesy of Beavis and Butthead.
I heard this dude can like bench press 140. Whoa, that's pretty good. Maybe he'll be in the 200 club someday.
And more than anything else, the decades-long legal battle between Glenn Danzig, Jerry Only, and Doyle over who owned the rights to the Misfits name finally reached an end in 1995. The deal was that Jerry and Doyle would give all the publishing rights to the Misfits back catalog to Glenn, which seemed only fair because Glenn did write almost 100% of those songs. In exchange, Jerry and Doyle would be allowed to record and perform under the name of the Misfits, and they would all split the merchandise rights. And shortly after that, they released the Misfits box set, which for the very first time ever in an official release collected just about everything the band ever recorded. So finally you could actually hear all these legendary songs without having to track down a bunch of bootlegs or obscure records. And with that, the Misfits were back. At least, kind of. Glenn Danzig turned down their offer to reunite with the band, and so they replaced him with the 19-year-old Michale Graves. And Michale Graves recorded 2 albums with them, American Psycho and Famous Monsters, that really divided the fan base. On the one hand, there were the people who agreed with former Misfits guitarist Bobby Steele, who said, "It's just Jerry Only doing the Al Bundy deal, trying to relive his glory days and fucking up the whole thing in the process." But on the other hand, there's also people who love the Graves era. Personally, I can't really listen to it, but I do understand how the cleaner production and metal influences could be appealing to some people. But as always seems to be the case with the Misfits, that couldn't last. That lineup fell apart in 2000, leaving the band as basically Jerry Only with a revolving cast of supporting members, including Dez from Black Flag, Ken from Candiria, Zoli from Ignite, and tons more over the years. And in my opinion, the Jerry era of the Misfits is pretty spotty. For example, their album of 1950s covers or their song about the New York Rangers. And over the years, you would always hear these rumors of a Misfits reunion, but they never really seemed to come together. And it seemed like the Misfits were just sort of destined to live on as the Jerry only show until the unthinkable happened. In 2016, the news broke that Glenn would be joining Doyle and Jerry on stage at Riot Fest, bringing the classic Misfits lineup together for the first time in 33 years, with the addition of Dave Lombardo from Slayer on drums.
Are you happy that the new version of the Misfits are touring and still putting out CDs?
I don't really care.
You don't care either way.
Yeah.
They also played a handful of arena shows in 2019. I was fortunate enough to see them in Seattle on tour with the Cro-Mags, and honestly, they were great. And they've played a few more shows since then, most recently just this summer. And although as far as I know, they don't have any more shows announced, I would be pretty surprised if this is the last we see of the original Misfits. Which brings us to the final question: what is the lasting impact and influence of the Misfits? Well, first of all, there's the debate about what the Misfits even are. Personally, I'm a purist. In my mind, only the original Danzig era is actually the Misfits. And so when I'm talking about the Misfits, that is what I mean. And with that being said, it's really hard to overstate exactly how influential they were with their music, with the visuals, really just with everything. In my opinion, all the Danzig era Misfits songs sound just as good now as the day they were recorded. Somehow, even the terrible production actually makes it sound cooler to me. And whether directly or indirectly, they've influenced just about every band that plays any kind of rock or metal. But in particular, I would point to bands like AFI, who had Devil Locks for a while, and their cover of Halloween is one of the band's defining songs. There's also My Chemical Romance. Really any band that uses those whoa-ohs, I feel like they probably got that from the Misfits. And there's also that whole scene of horror punk bands that are all basically iterating on what the Misfits started, for example, Blitzkid or Balzac. And beyond that, I think you just have to give them a lot of credit for building an absolutely incredible brand. The logo, the imagery, the lyrics, it's honestly up there with the true greats of rock and roll branding like the Rolling Stones or Pink Floyd. And ultimately, I think Glenn Danzig really summed it up on stage at their first reunion show. About 40 years ago, Jerry and I got on stage in New York, and we shocked the whole fucking punk scene who didn't know what the fuck to make of us. We didn't look like anybody. We didn't sound like anybody. And he was right. They're often imitated, but never, ever duplicated. Nobody will ever do it like the Misfits. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments, and I would like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my videos and podcasts a week early. There's members-only channels in my Discord. I do giveaways. There's also a way to have me review your music or artwork or anything else. So if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.